I never thought I'd be sitting in my kitchen at 67, staring at my phone for 3 months straight, waiting for my only child to call me back. The boy I raised in this same bedroom walk-up, who used to save quarters to buy me drugstore perfume for Mother's Day, now owns a glass penthouse on the Upper East Side and hasn't spoken to me since Christmas. Calvin Munro, CEO of TechVantage Solutions, featured on Forbes covers, married to a woman whose Instagram has more followers than our old neighborhood's residents. But here's what those magazine articles don't mention: the woman who worked double shifts at Roosevelt Elementary, who sold her engagement ring to pay for his SAT prep, who gave up everything so he could have anything. How do you make someone remember love when success has made them forget where they came from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I twist my late husband's wedding ring around my finger as I sit at the kitchen table where Calvin used to do his homework. The simple gold band catches the morning light streaming through windows that haven't been updated since 1987, but I've never seen the need. This apartment holds too much history to abandon for something shinier. Tasha used to say this ring would outlast us both, and looking at it now, 27 years after his funeral, I believe he was right. The metal is worn thin in places, smoothed by decades of my thumb running across it whenever I needed to feel connected to something larger than myself. It's the same gesture I made the night Calvin was born, when the doctors told me Tasha wouldn't make it through his injuries from the construction accident. That was 30 years ago, when Calvin was just 10 and still believed his father hung the moon. The kitchen still smells faintly of the lemon verbena tea I brew every morning, a habit I picked up from my own mother. She used to say rituals keep you grounded when everything else shifts like sand beneath your feet. I've needed that grounding more than ever these past few months, watching my son transform into someone I barely recognized through social media posts and business magazine features. Calvin's elementary school report card still hangs on the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like an apple that one of my former students gave me, Mrs. Rodriguez, 4th grade, 1995. Calvin shows exceptional promise in mathematics and science. His curiosity about how things work is remarkable for his age. I remember the pride that swelled in my chest when I read those words, how I called Yasmin immediately to share the news, how I tucked an extra 20 into Calvin's backpack the next day so he could buy himself something special from the school store. Those were the days when Calvin would burst through the front door every afternoon, backpack flying, eager to tell me about his latest discovery. He'd spread his homework across this same table, pencils scattered like pickup sticks, asking me to quiz him on multiplication tables or help him with science projects that inevitably took over our entire living room. I remember the volcano we built for his 5th grade science fair, how we spent 3 weekends perfecting the baking soda and vinegar eruption, how his face lit up when it won 2nd place. The apartment feels larger without his presence, though. Nothing has changed physically. The same burgundy couch Tasha and I bought at a church rummage sale still dominates the living room. The same family photos line the mantelpiece above the radiator that clanks through winter nights. Calvin's high school graduation picture sits prominently in the center, his smile wide and genuine, arms slung around my shoulders as we posed outside Lincoln High School. I was so proud that day, watching him walk across that stage knowing he'd earned a full scholarship to Columbia. All those nights I'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table grading papers. All those summers I'd worked at the community center instead of taking vacation. All those small sacrifices had led to that moment. I still remember the way he hugged me that graduation day, lifting me off my feet despite being only 18. "Mom, we did it," he whispered in my ear. "I'm going to make you so proud." And he did, for years. Through college, through his master's program at MIT, through his first job at a startup that barely paid enough to cover his student loans. He called every Sunday without fail, visited during holidays, brought me flowers on my birthday. The change came gradually, like winter settling into your bones. First, the Sunday calls became every other Sunday, then monthly, then whenever he remembered. His visits grew shorter, his attention divided between his phone and our conversations. He started talking about networking events and professional obligations in a way that made our quiet dinners feel inadequate. When he landed the position at TechVantage, when the company went public, when he bought the penthouse, each success seemed to create more distance between us. Yasmin thinks I should be angrier. She stops by most afternoons after her shift at the hospital, settling into the chair across from me with her trademark directness. Delilah, you raised a boy who's forgotten his raising, she said just yesterday, stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. That's not on you, that's on him. But I can't reconcile the Calvin who used to make me Mother's Day cards with crayon and construction paper with the Calvin who hasn't returned my calls since I left a voicemail congratulating him on his engagement. I learned about his engagement the same way I learn most things about his life now, through Google alerts I set up for his name. The announcement appeared in the New York Times wedding section, complete with photos of him and Natalie Langford at some charity gala, her hand displaying a diamond that probably cost more than I made in my last 5 years of teaching. They looked happy, polished, like they belonged in that world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. There was no mention of his family, no quote about how his mother couldn't wait to meet his bride. The wedding invitation never came. I checked my mailbox obsessively for weeks, wondering if perhaps it had been lost or delivered to the wrong address. I even called Calvin's assistant, a pleasant young woman named Miranda who always seemed genuinely sorry when she told me he was in meetings. I'm sure it's just an oversight, Mrs. Munro, she said when I finally worked up the courage to ask about it. I'll mention it to him. But the wedding came and went, documented extensively on Natalie's Instagram, and I watched my son promise his life to someone else while sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The photo showed a ceremony that probably cost more than I ever made in a year. Natalie looked radiant in a dress that required its own zip code. Calvin handsome in a tuxedo that fit him like it was painted on. The venue was summer stayed in the Hamptons, all rolling lawns and ocean views, filled with people who looked like they'd never worried about rent or grocery bills. I studied every image, searching for some sign that he'd thought of me, some empty chair that might have been saved with hope I'd appear. But there was nothing, just the life he'd built that had no room for the woman who'd built him that night. I took out the photo albums I haven't opened in years, spreading them across the kitchen table like tarot cards revealing a different future. Here was Calvin at 3, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his birthday party in our living room. Here he was at 8, missing his front teeth, holding up a painting he'd made me for Christmas. Here we were when he was 15, both of us exhausted, but grinning after assembling his new computer from parts we'd saved up to buy over 6 months. Each image was a small reminder of who we used to be to each other. Before success redefined love as something that could be outgrown, I closed the albums around midnight. My eyes dry despite the ache in my chest. Anger would have been easier. But what I felt was something closer to bewilderment. How do you grieve someone who's still alive, but has chosen to become a stranger? How do you process being erased from a story you spent your entire adult life writing? The next morning, I made my tea, sat in my chair, and realized something had shifted overnight. The hurt was still there, sharp and persistent as winter wind. But underneath, it was something else, a quiet resolve, perhaps. A recognition that waiting for Calvin to remember me was giving him power over my worth that he'd never asked for and didn't deserve. I looked around the apartment that had been my world for 30 years, at the evidence of a life lived with purpose and love, and decided it was time to stop making myself small enough to fit into someone else's definition of success. Calvin had built something impressive, but he'd forgotten the foundation it rested on. Maybe it was time to remind him, not through tears or confrontation, but through the same quiet strength that had carried us both this far. The morning I discovered Calvin was featured on the cover of Manhattan Business Weekly, I was standing in line at the grocery store, reaching for a pack of gum, when his face smiled back at me from the magazine rack. Tech visionary transforms industry, the headline proclaimed, with a smaller subtitle that made my breath catch. From humble beginnings to Silicon success, I bought the magazine with shaking hands, not even checking the price. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot and read every word. The article painted a picture of a self-made man who'd overcome challenging circumstances to build a tech empire. It mentioned his scholarship to Columbia, his graduate work at MIT, his innovative approach to data analytics. But when it came to those humble beginnings, the details became deliberately vague. No mention of the two-bedroom apartment in Queens, no mention of a mother who worked double shifts, no mention of a father who died providing for his family. Calvin had given them a story sanitized of everything that might make potential investors uncomfortable. I learned early that success requires sacrifice. He was quoted as saying, "Sometimes you have to leave certain things behind to move forward." Reading those words felt like being punched in the chest. I was apparently one of those certain things he decided to leave behind. I drove home with the magazine on my passenger seat, its glossy cover catching the afternoon light. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision. I was going to call him, not to cry or complain, but to congratulate him. Maybe if I approached him on his terms, celebrated his success without making him feel guilty about the distance between us, we could find our way back to each other. I dialed his direct number, the one he'd given me years ago with instructions to only use it for emergencies. His voicemail picked up immediately. "You've reached Calvin Munro, CEO of TechVantage Solutions. Please leave a detailed message, and I'll respond as soon as possible." His voice was confident, professional, completely unrecognizable as the boy who used to call me from college just to hear me say I loved him. "Calvin, it's Mom," I said after the beep, trying to keep my voice steady. I saw the article in Manhattan Business Weekly. "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. I know your father would be proud too. I just wanted to tell you that I love you, sweetheart. Call me when you can." 3 weeks passed without a response. I checked my phone obsessively, carried it from room to room, even took it to bed with me in case he called late. Yasmin stopped by on a Thursday afternoon and found me staring at the silent device like it might spontaneously ring if I concentrated hard enough. "Delilah, you're making yourself sick," she said, settling into her usual chair with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak truth. "When was the last time you left this apartment for something other than groceries?" I couldn't remember. The days had started blending together, each one measured by the phone that didn't ring, the messages that went unanswered. I'd been a teacher for 35 years, had shepherded hundreds of children through their formative years, had been the person parents called when they needed guidance or reassurance. Now I couldn't even get my own son to acknowledge my existence. "He's busy," I said, the excuse sounding hollow even to me. The article said the company is expanding internationally. "He's probably traveling, dealing with important business matters." Yasmin's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "Honey, being busy doesn't make you forget your mother exists. My girls call me from 3 different time zones, and they're not running million-dollar companies." This isn't about his schedule. The truth of her words settled in my chest like a stone. I knew she was right, but admitting it meant facing something I wasn't ready to confront. that my son had chosen to cut me out of his life, and no amount of understanding or excuses could change that reality. That evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in months. I cooked. Not the simple meals I'd been surviving on, but the kind of elaborate dinner I used to make when Calvin was young, and food was one of the primary ways I showed love. I made his favourite, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, cornbread from scratch, apple pie with a lattice crust that took me an hour to have properly doughed as the smells filled the apartment. I felt something I'd almost forgotten: purpose. This was who I'd been for so many years, the woman who created warmth and comfort from simple ingredients and endless love. I set the table for it out of habit, then caught myself and removed the extra place setting. The gesture felt symbolic. Somehow, like I was finally accepting that the person I'd been cooking for all these years no longer existed. I ate dinner alone. But for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it felt like space room to think, to remember who I was beyond my role as Calvin's mother. The pot roast was perfectly seasoned, the cornbread golden and crumbly, the pie sweet with just enough tartness to make it interesting. I'd created something beautiful without an audience, and that realization felt like the first crack in a wall I'd been building around myself. After dinner, I pulled out a box I'd kept hidden in my bedroom closet for years. It contained every letter Calvin had written me during college, every card he'd made as a child, every program from school plays and science fairs. I spread them across the kitchen table like evidence in a case I was trying to solve, when the boy who wrote "Thank you for believing in me always" turned into the man who couldn't spare 5 minutes for a phone call. The shift had been so gradual I'd missed it happening. Looking back, I could see the signs, conversations that became more focused on his achievements and less on his feelings, visits that felt more like obligations than desires, a growing impatience with anything that reminded him of where he'd come from. Success had given him the power to rewrite his history, and apparently I was a chapter he decided to edit out. One letter, dated from his sophomore year at Columbia, stopped me cold. "Mom, I know I don't say it enough, but everything I accomplish is because of you. When I feel like giving up, I think about all the sacrifices you made, all the times you went without so I could have what I needed. I promise I'll never forget that. I promise I'll make sure you're taken care of the way you took care of me." I read those words 3 times, each reading making them feel more like evidence of a person who disappeared, the Calvin who wrote. That letter wouldn't have left me out of his wedding. He wouldn't have ignored my calls for months. He wouldn't have told a magazine that success required leaving things behind without acknowledging what those things had given him in the first place. But sitting there surrounded by artifacts of our shared history, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. The hurt was still there, deep and persistent, but the anger had transformed into something else: determination. Calvin had decided I was expendable, but that didn't mean I had to accept his assessment. I'd spent 30 years defining myself through his needs, his achievements, his approval. Maybe it was time to remember who I was when I wasn't being anyone's mother. I gathered up the letters and cards, placing them carefully back in the box. They were my memories now, not weapons to use against him or evidence to present for his consideration. They were proof that I'd loved well and completely, that I'd given everything I had to give. That was enough, even if he couldn't see it anymore. The next morning, I called the number on a flyer Yasmin had left behind weeks ago. "Queen's Community Centre," a cheerful voice answered. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to volunteer," I said, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "I'm a retired teacher, and I'm looking for ways to stay involved in the community." "That's wonderful," the woman replied. "We always need help with our literacy program. When can you come in for orientation?" As I scheduled my first volunteer shift, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not for Calvin's call or his approval or his return to the person he used to be, but for something that belonged entirely to me. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something larger, life that existed beyond the shadow of someone else's success or failure to acknowledge my worth. When I hung up the phone, I looked around the apartment with new eyes. It wasn't a museum to a relationship that no longer existed or a waiting room for a son who might never return. It was my home, filled with evidence of a life lived with intention and love. Calvin could choose to forget where he came from, but I didn't have to disappear just because he decided to stop seeing me. The Queens Community Centre sat on Northern Boulevard like a beacon of faded hope, its brick facade weathered but sturdy. Windows bright with children's artwork and community announcements. Walking through those doors for my first volunteer orientation felt like stepping back into a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed: the teacher, the helper, the woman who found purpose in service to others. Maria Santos, the program coordinator, greeted me with the kind of warm handshake that immediately puts you at ease. She was probably in her 40s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who cared too much about too many people with too few resources. "Mrs. Munro, we are so grateful for your experience," she said, leading me down a hallway lined with photos of community events and achievement certificates. 35 years in the school system, you're exactly what our adult literacy program needs. The classroom where I'd be working was smaller than the ones I remembered from Roosevelt Elementary, but the familiar smell of markers and photocopier toner made something in my chest loosen. Folding tables and mismatched chairs were arranged in a circle, and a whiteboard dominated one wall, already marked with the remnants of someone else's lesson. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. Most of our students are working adults, Maria explained, flipping through a folder of registration forms. Single mothers trying to help their kids with homework, immigrants working to improve their English, older folks who never had the chance to finish their education. They come here after long days, tired but determined. It takes a special kind of patience to work with them. Patience. I almost laughed at the irony. I'd spent the last 3 months learning a different kind of patience, the kind that came with waiting for phone calls that never came, for acknowledgement that might never arrive. Maybe it was time to redirect that energy toward people who actually wanted what I had to offer. My first class was the following Tuesday evening. 6 students showed up, ranging in age from 23 to 68. There was Rosa, a housekeeper from El Salvador who wanted to read bedtime stories to her grandchildren. In English, Miguel, a construction worker whose thick accent masked his sharp intelligence and dry sense of humor. Janet, a woman my age who dropped out of school in 9th grade to care for her siblings and was finally pursuing her GED. Each person carried a story of deferred dreams and quiet determination that reminded me why I'd become a teacher in the first place. "I want to write letters to my son," Janet told me during a break, her hands shaking slightly as she held her pencil. "He's in the military, stationed overseas. I can call him, but I want to send him something he can hold, something written in my own hand. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. More sense than anything had in months. As weeks passed, the community centre became my sanctuary. I arrived early to prepare lessons, stayed late to help students with individual challenges, and found myself thinking about their progress instead of Calvin's silence. Rosa began reading simple chapter books to her grandchildren, her face glowing when she told me how they clapped when she finished each story. Miguel passed his citizenship test and brought me a bouquet of flowers from the bodega where he'd started working part-time. Janet wrote her first letter to her son, 3 paragraphs of careful cursive that made her cry with pride. It was during one of these evening classes that I met someone who would change the trajectory of my new life. Milo Emerson appeared in our classroom doorway one Tuesday evening. looking apologetic and slightly lost. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice carrying the careful diction of someone who'd spent years in professional settings. "I'm looking for the financial planning seminar." "I think I'm in the wrong room." Maria appeared behind him, consultation clipboard in hand. "Actually, you're in the right place. We're combining the literacy class and the financial planning seminar tonight. Mrs. Munro, this is Milo Emerson. He's volunteering to help our students understand basic financial concepts." "Milo, this is Delilah Munro, our literacy instructor." Milo was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His handshake was firm but gentle, and when he smiled, laugh lines crinkled at the corners of his eyes. Everything about him suggested quiet competence and genuine warmth. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said. "I've heard wonderful things about the work you're doing here. Maria tells me some of your students are interested in learning about retirement planning and savings accounts." What followed was one of the most engaging classes I'd ever been part of. Milo had a gift for making complex financial concepts accessible without being condescending. He talked about compound interest using the example of Rose's grandchildren's piggy banks, explained investment principles through Miguel's construction projects, and made budgeting feel empowering rather than restrictive. My students hung on every word, asking questions that revealed how much they'd been thinking about their financial futures. After class, as we cleaned up the scattered handouts and erased the whiteboard, Milo lingered. "Your students are remarkable," he said, stacking chairs with practiced efficiency. "I've done these seminars at country clubs and corporate offices, but I've never seen people so engaged with the material. You've created something special here. They're hungry to learn," I replied, gathering pencils into a coffee can that served as our supply container. Most of them have never had anyone explain these things without trying to sell them something. "Your approach is refreshing." He paused in his chair stacking and looked at me thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something? What made you start volunteering here? You clearly have extensive teaching experience. You could probably find work at any number of private schools or tutoring centers." The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on moving forward that I hadn't really examined what I was moving away from. But something about Milo's genuine curiosity made me want to answer honestly. I needed to remember who I was when I wasn't being useful to someone who decided I wasn't valuable anymore, I said, the words coming out more raw than I'd intended. He nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Divorce. Worse. A son who's outgrown his mother." We stood in the empty classroom, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I found myself telling him about Calvin. Not the whole story, but enough to explain the hollow feeling that had driven me to seek purpose elsewhere. Milo listened without offering solutions or platitudes, just nodding occasionally and making small sounds of understanding. "I went through something similar," he said when I finished. "Not with a child, but with a marriage that ended when my ex-wife decided my values had become inconvenient to her social aspirations. It's a particular kind of pain, being discarded by someone you'd built your identity around loving." His honesty surprised me. Most people, when faced with personal revelations, either change the subject or launch into advice mode. Milo simply acknowledged the reality and let it sit between us without trying to fix it. "What helped you move through it?" I asked. "Time," he said simply, "and finding ways to invest in people who actually wanted what I had to offer. People like your students, like the folks I work with here. It doesn't heal the original wound, but it creates new sources of meaning." As we walked to the parking lot together, Milo handed me a business card. It was simple, cream-colored cardstock with his name and phone number. No fancy logos or titles. "I know this might be presumptuous," he said, "but if you ever want to talk about financial planning for yourself, I'd be happy to help. Pro bono, of course." I've found that teachers, especially long-time teachers, often don't have anyone looking out for their financial interests. I slipped the card into my purse, not sure whether I'd ever use it, but touched by the gesture. It had been a long time since someone had offered to help me without expecting anything in return. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Milo's business card, thinking about the evening's revelations. For the first time in months, I'd gone an entire day without checking my phone for messages from Calvin. The realization should have felt like progress, but instead, it felt like a small betrayal, as if forgetting to hope for his call meant I was giving up on him entirely. But maybe that was the point. Maybe loving someone didn't require maintaining vigil for their return. Maybe the most loving thing I could do for both of us was to build a life rich enough to survive his absence, substantial enough to stand on its own merit. If Calvin ever decided to come back, he'd find a mother who'd remembered her own worth instead of one who'd withered away waiting for his validation. I tucked Milo's card into the frame of the mirror above my dresser, next to a photo of Calvin from his high school graduation. Not because I was ready to call him, but because it represented something new. The possibility that my story didn't end with my son's rejection. It might just be beginning. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, mixed in with the usual stack of bills and grocery store circulars. At first glance, it looked like junk mail, the kind of official-looking envelope that usually contains credit card offers or magazine subscriptions. But the return address caught my attention. Reliable Life Insurance Company, Claims Department. I almost threw it away. Tasha's life insurance had been settled decades ago, the modest payout helping us survive those first terrible months after his death. But something made me open it anyway, standing right there in my building's mailbox vestibule with Mrs. Chen waiting impatiently behind me for her turn. Dear Mrs. Munro, the letter began. Our records indicate that you may be entitled to benefits from a supplemental life insurance policy taken out by your late husband, Thaddeus Munro, through his employer, Brennan Construction Company. Due to a recent audit of unclaimed policies, we have discovered that this benefit was never processed. Following Mr. Munro's death in 1994, my hand started shaking as I read the details. Apparently, Tasha had taken out an additional policy through his union, separate from the one I'd known about. The paperwork had been lost in a merger between insurance companies, and the policy had been sitting dormant for 27 years. Accumulating interest, with penalties and growth, it was now worth $43,000. $40,000. More money than I'd ever had at one time in my entire life. I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment in a daze, the letter clutched in my hand like a lottery ticket. Once inside, I spread it out on the kitchen table and read it again, then a third time, checking for fine print or catches that might make it too good to be true. But it seemed legitimate official letterhead, specific policy numbers, detailed instructions for claiming the benefits. My first instinct was to call Calvin. This was exactly the kind of good news I'd want to share with him, the kind of unexpected windfall that might make him proud of how well I was managing on my own. I actually picked up my phone and started dialing before catching myself. Why was my impulse still to seek his approval for my good fortune? When had I started believing that my experiences only mattered if he validated them? Instead, I called. Yasmin, $43,000. She shrieked, loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Delilah, do you know what you could do with that money? You could travel, renovate this place, buy a car that doesn't require prayer, to start in the morning. All true, but as the initial shock wore off, I found myself thinking about something else entirely. That morning's literacy class had been particularly challenging. Rosa had been struggling with a story about a grandmother teaching her granddaughter to cook, getting frustrated when she couldn't sound out words like ingredients and tradition. The community centre's reading materials were limited, mostly donated textbooks and photocopied worksheets that made learning feel like punishment rather than discovery. I want to do something meaningful with it, I told Yasmin, something that. That evening, I pulled Milo's business card from my mirror frame and called the number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Delilah, what a pleasant surprise. How are things at the community centre? I told him about the insurance money, about my desire to use it purposefully rather than just adding it to my savings account. He listened without interrupting, asking thoughtful questions about my goals and timeline. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Would you like to meet for coffee tomorrow? He suggested. I'd be happy to walk through some options with you. There are ways to make that money work for you while also supporting causes you care about. We met at a small cafe near the community centre, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and a bulletin board covered in local announcements. Milo arrived with a leather portfolio and a gentle smile, ordering black coffee and listening intently as I explained my half-formed ideas about using the money to support adult education. What if, he said, pulling out a legal pad and uncapping a pen, instead of just donating the money, you used it to create something permanent? A foundation or an endowment fund that could generate ongoing support for programs like the one you're working with. The idea had never occurred to me. In my world, foundations were things established by wealthy philanthropists, not retired teachers from Queens. But as Milo sketched out the possibilities, explaining how even a modest amount could be leveraged into sustainable funding through careful investment and community partnerships, I began to see the potential. You could call it the Tasha Monroe Memorial Fund, he suggested, in honor of your husband, supporting educational opportunities for working adults. With the right structure, $43,000 could generate several $1,000s in annual grants for years to come. The name made my breath catch. Tasha had believed in education the way some people believe in religion as a fundamental force for good in the world. He'd worked construction to support our family, but he'd always talked about going back to school someday, getting his GED, maybe even taking some college courses. The accident had stolen that possibility from him, but this felt like a way to honor the dream he'd never been able to pursue. How would it work? I asked. Milo explained the process, establishing the fund through a community foundation, setting up an advisory board, creating criteria for grants, and developing relationships with organizations that serve the population we wanted to help. It would require paperwork and meetings and a level of involvement I'd never imagined for myself, but it also offered something I'd been missing, a sense of purpose that belonged entirely to me. There's one more thing to consider, Milo said, closing his portfolio and looking at me seriously. This kind of project gets attention. Local newspapers, community organizations, maybe even some of the business publications that cover philanthropic efforts. Are you prepared for that level of visibility? The question surprised me. I'd spent so many months feeling invisible, erased from Calvin's life and story, that the idea of choosing visibility felt revolutionary. But it also felt terrifying. What if Calvin saw the articles and felt embarrassed by his mother's sudden public presence? What if it made him even less likely to reconcile with me? Then I thought about Rosa, struggling over words that would help her connect with her grandchildren. About Miguel, proudly showing me his citizenship certificate. About Janet, finally writing letters to her son in her own careful script. These people deserve resources and support, regardless of whether my son approved of my methods for providing them. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I'm ready for visibility. Over the following weeks, Milo guided me through the process of establishing the fund. We met twice a week, sometimes at the cafe, sometimes at his small office in a renovated brownstone that served as headquarters for several local nonprofits. I learned about investment strategies and grant-making procedures, about 501c3 regulations and donor stewardship. For the first time in months, I felt like I was learning and growing rather than just surviving. The paperwork was daunting, but Milo was patient, explaining each form and requirement without making me feel ignorant. He introduced me to lawyers and accountants who specialized in nonprofit work, professionals who treated my small foundation with the same seriousness they give to $1 million endowment. Scale doesn't determine impact, one of the lawyers told me during our first meeting. I've seen $50,000 foundations change entire communities because they were focused and persistent. What matters is clarity of purpose and commitment to the mission. As we developed the foundation's mission statement, I found myself thinking about legacy in ways I never had before. Calvin had built something impressive in the business world, something that generated wealth and employed people and solved technological problems. But what was my legacy? What would remain after I was gone to prove that my life had mattered? The Tasha Munro Memorial Fund felt like an answer to that question. Not just a donation or a gesture, but a living tribute to the values that had shaped our family, the belief that education could transform lives, that everyone deserved the chance to learn and grow, that working people's dreams mattered as much as anyone else's. The night we finalized the paperwork, I sat in my kitchen with the official documents spread across the table. The fund was real now, legally established, ready to begin accepting applications and making grants. In 6 months, I'd gone from feeling completely powerless to creating something that could outlast me, something that would continue supporting students like Rosa and Miguel long after I was gone. I picked up my phone to call Calvin, then set it down again. This wasn't about him anymore. This wasn't an attempt to impress him or win back his attention. This was mine, my choice, my legacy, my way of honoring the man who'd loved us both and the values that had shaped our family when we were still a family. But as I prepared for bed that night, I couldn't help wondering if he'd be proud of what I was building, not because I needed his approval, but because part of me still believed in the boy who'd written those letters from college, who'd promised never to forget what I'd sacrificed for him. Maybe this foundation would help him remember not just where he came from, but who he came from, a woman strong enough to transform grief into purpose, smart enough to turn an unexpected windfall into lasting change. The first grant applications for the Tasha Munro Memorial Fund arrived in early November, just as the Queen's Community Centre was decorating for their annual Thanksgiving celebration. Maria had placed a cardboard box labelled Foundation Applications on the reception desk, and every time I walked past it, I felt a mixture of pride and terror at what I'd set in motion. 12 applications in the first week, Maria reported. During our weekly planning meeting, word is spreading faster than we expected. The Immigrant Services Centre in Elmhurst heard about it, and they're sending over applications for 3 of their students. Even the Senior Centre in Flushing wants to apply for funding for a computer literacy program. I'd imagine the fund would help a few students like the ones in my class, maybe purchase some new books or cover registration fees for GED programs. But the applications painted a picture of need I hadn't fully comprehended. Single mothers wanting to learn English so they could help their children with homework. Older adults who'd never learned to drive and needed literacy skills to pass the written test. Immigrants with professional degrees from their home countries who needed to improve their English to get licensed in their fields. Each application was a story of deferred dreams and quiet determination. Maria and I spent hours reading through them at the kitchen table that had become our unofficial foundation headquarters, sorting them into categories and trying to figure out how to stretch our initial $5,000 in annual grants to meet the overwhelming demand. We need more funding, I said, stating the obvious as we looked at worthy applications that totaled nearly $20,000 in requests. Or more visibility, Maria suggested. Have you thought about reaching out to local businesses for additional support? Some of these employers might be interested in sponsoring literacy programs for their workers. The idea made sense, but it also made me nervous. Asking for money felt presumptuous, like claiming expertise I didn't possess. But as I looked at the stack of applications, I realized my comfort level mattered less than the students who needed our help. That's when Milo suggested something that would change everything. There's a journalist I know, he said during one of our coffee meetings. Arielle Lewis, she writes human interest pieces for the Queen's Chronicle and sometimes freelances for the city papers. She's always looking for stories about community initiatives that are making a real difference. Would you be interested in talking to her? My first instinct was to decline. Being featured in a newspaper felt too much like seeking attention for its own sake, but Milo explained how media coverage could help us reach potential donors and connect with other organizations doing similar work. It wasn't about personal recognition, it was about amplifying the foundation's impact. Let me think about it, I said, but I was already imagining the possibilities. If an article could help us fund even 2 or 3 additional grants, wasn't it worth the discomfort of being in the spotlight? Arielle Lewis turned out to be a woman in her early 30s with curly hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of intelligent eyes that made you feel like she was really listening. We met at the community centre on a Tuesday evening, arriving early so she could observe one of my literacy classes in action. She sat quietly in the corner, taking notes as Rosa struggled through a paragraph about Thanksgiving traditions, and Miguel helped Janet sound out words she'd never seen written down. I'd been nervous about having an observer, worried it might make my students self-conscious, but they seemed energized by her presence, eager to share their stories and progress. After class, we sat in the empty classroom while Arielle asked questions. That revealed how thoroughly she'd researched both the foundation and my background. I'm particularly interested in your motivation for starting this fund, she said, her pen poised over a notebook covered in neat handwriting. You had a successful career in education, you're financially comfortable in retirement. What drove you to take on this kind of project? The question forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling, but hadn't fully examined. I think I realized that my value as a person couldn't depend on someone else's assessment of my worth, I said slowly. I'd spent so many years defining myself through other people's needs and achievements that I'd forgotten I could create something meaningful on my own. Can you elaborate on that? I found myself telling her about Calvin, though I tried to keep the focus on my journey rather than his failures. I talked about the isolation of having your primary relationship disappear, about the way rejection can make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. But I also talked about the liberation of discovering that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. So, in some ways, starting this foundation was an act of self-preservation. Arielle asked, more like self-discovery, I corrected. I had to remember who I was when I wasn't being useful to someone who decided I wasn't valuable anymore. She scribbled furiously, then looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Munro, can I ask you something that might be personal? Do you mind if I research your son's background? I'm not looking to create drama or invade anyone's privacy, but his success story might provide interesting context for your journey. My stomach dropped. I'd been careful not to mention Calvin's name or identify him in any way that could embarrass him professionally. The last thing I wanted was to create problems for his career or personal life. I'd prefer you leave him out of it, I said carefully. This story isn't about him. It's about the foundation and the students we're serving. Ariel nodded, but I could see the journalist's curiosity in her eyes. Of course, but I want you to know that if there's a broader story here about family, success, and giving back, it might help your cause to tell it. People connect with personal narratives more than institutional ones. I promised to think about it, but privately, I'd already decided. Whatever complicated feelings I had about Calvin's rejection, I wouldn't use them as ammunition in a public forum. If the foundation succeeded, it would be on its own merits, not because I'd generated sympathy by airing family grievances. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, with Ariel asking detailed questions about the grant process, the students we served, and my long-term vision for the fund. By the time she packed up her notebook and voice recorder, I felt like I'd been turned inside out and examined under a microscope. When will the article run? I asked as we walked to the parking lot. Probably next week in the Chronicle, and I'm hoping to place a longer version with one of the city papers. This is exactly the kind of positive community story that doesn't get enough attention. That night, I called Yasmin to tell her about the interview. You know Calvin's going to see it, right? She said with characteristic directness. His name might not be in the article, but if it gets picked up by the bigger papers, someone's going to make the connection. Are you prepared for that? I'd been trying not to think about that possibility, but she was right. Calvin Munro wasn't exactly a common name, and if anyone bothered to research my background, they'd quickly discover my connection to the TechVantage CEO. The question was whether that would help or hurt the Foundation's mission. Maybe it's time he remembered where he came from, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. Now that's the Delilah I remember, Yasmin said with approval. The woman who taught remedial reading to 8th graders who everyone else had given up on. You never back down from a challenge when it mattered. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the stack of grant applications that still needed review. Each one represented someone who believed in the possibility of transformation, someone willing to work hard for the chance to improve their circumstances. They weren't asking for handouts or sympathy, they were asking for opportunity. If my son saw the article and felt embarrassed by his mother's public work in adult education, that would tell me everything I needed to know about who he'd become. But if it reminded him of the values we'd once shared, if it sparked even a moment of recognition or pride, then maybe something good could come from this exposure. Either way, I'd built something real and meaningful, something that would continue, making a difference long after any newspaper articles were forgotten. The foundation wasn't a message to Calvin or an attempt to reclaim his attention. It was proof that I could create a legacy worthy of the sacrifices I'd made, worthy of the life I'd lived, worthy of the love I'd given whether or not it was returned. 3 days later, Ariel called to tell me the article would run in the Sunday edition of the Queen's Chronicle, with a longer feature planned for the New York Daily News the following week. I marked both dates on my calendar, then tried to forget about them. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it. The Sunday morning the article appeared in the Queen's Chronicle, I almost didn't buy a copy. I'd been awake since 5 o'clock, alternating between excitement and terror about seeing my story in print. By the time the corner newsstand opened at 7, I'd changed my mind about reading it at least 6 times, but there it was on page 3. Retired teacher honours late husband with education fund, accompanied by a photo of me standing in the community centre classroom. I looked older than I'd expected, more serious, but also more substantial somehow. Like someone who'd earned the right to take up space in the world, Ariel had done beautiful work. The article captured not just the mechanics of the foundation, but the heart of why it mattered. She'd interviewed several of my students, including Rosa and Miguel, who spoke eloquently about the impact of having access to quality educational materials and dedicated instruction. The piece painted a picture of community resilience and the power of individual action to create meaningful change. but it was the final paragraph that took my breath away. Munro's foundation may be small in scope, but its impact resonates far beyond the number of grants awarded. In choosing to transform personal loss into community gain, she's created a legacy that honors both her late husband's memory and her own commitment to education. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with one person deciding their story isn't finished yet. I read those words 3 times before my phone started ringing. The first call was from Maria, practically shouting with excitement, "Delilah, you need to see what's happening." We've gotten 7 phone calls already this morning from people wanting to donate to the foundation. 7, and it's not even 9 o'clock yet. Then Yasmin called, followed by former colleagues from Roosevelt Elementary, followed by neighbors I barely knew who'd seen the article and wanted to tell me how proud they were. My quiet Sunday morning turned into a celebration I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I deserved. But it was the email that arrived at 2:47 p.m. that changed everything. I'd finally figured out how to check my email on the tablet Yasmin had given me for my birthday, though I still preferred phone calls and handwritten letters. The message was from someone named Jennifer Walsh at the New York Times Metro desk. "Dear Mrs. Munro," it read, "I saw the feature about your foundation in the Queen's Chronicle, and I am wondering if you'd be interested in speaking with me about a possible story for our Metro section. We're always looking for inspiring stories about community leaders making a difference in outer borough neighborhoods. Please call me when you have a chance to discuss." The New York Times wanted to interview me, the newspaper I'd been reading every Sunday for 40 years. The publication that had announced Calvin's engagement wanted to write about the foundation I'd built from an insurance check and a desire to matter again. I stared at the email for a full 10 minutes before calling Milo. "That's incredible news," he said, though I could hear a note of caution in his voice. The Times reaches a much broader audience than the Chronicle. It could bring in significant funding, but it also means much more scrutiny. Are you prepared for that level of attention? The question that had been nagging at me all day finally crystallized. "Milo, do you think Calvin has seen the Chronicle article?" "I don't know," he said gently. "Does it matter?" That was the question, wasn't it? Did it matter if Calvin saw the article and chose not to respond? Did it matter if he felt embarrassed or proud or completely indifferent? I'd started this foundation to honor Tasha's memory and support students who needed help. Everything else was just noise. "No," I said, and meant it. "It doesn't matter. Call Jennifer Walsh back and tell her I'm interested." The Times interview took place 3 days later at a small cafe in Manhattan, just a few blocks from Calvin's office. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be a seasoned journalist in her 50s with sharp eyes and an easy manner that put me at ease despite my nervousness about being in the city. "I'm particularly interested in the personal journey behind the foundation," she said after we'd ordered coffee and settled into a corner booth. "Starting a nonprofit at 67 isn't something most people would take on. What was the catalyst for you?" I'd practiced answers to this question, but sitting there in Manhattan, surrounded by the energy and ambition of a city where my son lived just blocks away, the practiced responses felt inadequate. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. I needed to remember that my worth as a person wasn't determined by someone else's ability to see it, I said. I'd spent so many years defining myself through other people's needs and achievements that when those relationships changed, I almost disappeared. Starting the foundation was my way of choosing to remain visible. Jennifer scribbled notes, then looked up with the expression I was beginning to recognize in journalists the moment when they sense a deeper story. "Can you tell me more about those relationships that changed?" I hesitated, thinking about my promise to keep Calvin out of the story. But something about Jennifer's direct gaze and genuine curiosity made me reconsider. Maybe the fuller story would help other people who'd experienced similar losses. Other parents who'd been left behind by children who'd outgrown their origins. My son, I said carefully, has built a very successful career in technology. As his life changed, as he moved into different social and professional circles, there was less and less room for his mother in his new reality. It's not uncommon, I think, for successful people to distance themselves from reminders of where they came from. That must have been painful. It was devastating, I admitted. But it also forced me to ask myself some difficult questions about who I was beyond my role as his mother. The foundation was my answer to those questions. Jennifer asked about the specifics of the fund, about my students, about my vision for the future. But I could tell she was still thinking about the personal story, the human drama that would make her readers care about a small foundation in Queens. Mrs. Munro, can I ask your son's name? I'm not looking to create controversy, but if he's as successful as you suggest, his story might provide important context for yours. My heart started beating faster. I'd rather not say. This isn't about him, of course, she said. But I saw her make a note that probably said something like research further. The interview lasted 90 minutes, covering everything from the grant application process to my teaching philosophy to my hopes for expanding the foundation's impact. By the time we shook hands outside the cafe, I felt like I'd been thoroughly examined and found worthy of serious journalistic attention. Walking back to the subway, I found myself looking up at the gleaming towers of Midtown Manhattan, wondering if Calvin was in one of those buildings. Maybe looking down at the street, where his mother had just been interviewed by the New York Times. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was finally getting the kind of attention and respect I'd craved. But it had nothing to do with him that evening. I called a meeting with Maria and the other community center staff to discuss how to handle the increased interest in the foundation. We'd received 17 calls that day from potential donors, 3 inquiries from other organizations wanting to partner with us, and applications from students who'd heard about the grants through word of mouth. We need to be prepared for this to get bigger than we originally planned, Maria said as we sat around the table where I'd first learned about Rose's struggles with reading. If the Times article gets picked up by other outlets, we could be looking at serious funding increases. That's wonderful, but it also means more responsibility. She was right. What had started as a modest memorial fund was turning into something with real potential for community impact. We needed better systems for processing applications, more rigorous criteria for awarding grants, and probably some kind of advisory board to help with oversight and strategic planning. Are you ready for that level of responsibility? Maria asked. Me directly. I thought about the question seriously before answering. 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in this same chair feeling sorry for myself and waiting for a phone call that never came. Now I was being asked to lead an organization that could touch hundreds of lives. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt right. Yes, I said. I'm ready. That night, as I prepared for bed, I realized I hadn't checked my phone for messages from Calvin in over a week. The realization should have felt like progress, but instead, it felt like a small betrayal, as if my independence meant I was giving up on him entirely. But maybe that was exactly what both of us needed, maybe the most. Loving thing I could do was stop waiting for him to remember me and start building something worthy of being remembered. The foundation was becoming that thing, a legacy that would outlast both of us. A testament to values that mattered regardless of who chose to embrace them. Tomorrow, the Times article would probably run, and everything might change again. But tonight, I was just a retired teacher from Queens who decided her story wasn't finished yet, and that was enough. The New York Times article ran on a Tuesday morning in early December, and by 10 a.m., my life had completely changed. I woke up to 17 missed calls on my phone, including 3 from numbers I didn't recognize and 1 from a 212 area code that made my heart skip a beat before I realized it wasn't Calvin's number. The first voicemail was from Jennifer Walsh. Mrs. Munro, the response to your story has been overwhelming. I've already gotten calls from 3 other news outlets wanting to follow up, and the Times website shows the article is trending in their local news section. You might want to prepare for a busy day. She was right. By noon, I'd fielded calls from News 12 Queens, NPR's local affiliate, and a producer from Good Morning America who wanted to know if I'd be available for a segment about grassroots philanthropy. The community centre's phone was ringing non-stop with donation offers, volunteer inquiries, and interview requests. Maria looked shell-shocked as she tried to manage the chaos. Delilah, we need help, she said during a brief lull in the calls. This is wonderful, but it's way beyond what our normal staff can handle. Do you know anyone who understands media relations? I didn't, but Milo did. When I called him in a panic around 2 p.m., he was already ahead of the situation. I've been fielding calls all morning, he said. Apparently, several news outlets contacted me as your financial advisor. I hope that's okay. I didn't give any detailed information, just confirmed that the foundation is legitimate and well managed. What are they all saying? That your story is resonating with people. The Times article has been shared thousands of times on social media. There's something about your journey that's striking a chord, the idea of transformation later in life, of finding purpose after loss, of choosing dignity over self-pity. The last phrase caught my attention, choosing dignity over self-pity. That's how one of the Twitter posts described it. Someone wrote, "This is what grace looks like in action. Delilah, you've become a symbol of something larger than the foundation itself." I wasn't sure how I felt about being a symbol. Symbols were distant, perfect, unchanging. I was just a woman who'd gotten tired of waiting for someone else to validate her existence. But the calls kept coming. By the end of the day, we'd received over 50 inquiries about donating to the foundation, including a message from a law firm representing an anonymous donor who wanted to contribute $25,000. CNN's New York bureau wanted to schedule an interview. A publisher's assistant called to ask if I'd ever considered writing a book about my experience. The attention was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. For months, I'd felt invisible, erased from the life of the person who mattered most to me. Now, strangers were calling to tell me I'd inspired them, that my story had given them courage to pursue their own deferred dreams. But it was the call that came at 8:30 that evening that stopped me cold. I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to process the day's events and plan for tomorrow's interviews, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Usually, I would have let it go to voicemail, but I'd been answering every call in case it was another media outlet or potential donor. Is this Delilah Munro? The voice was young, female, nervous. Yes, this is Delilah, Mrs. Munro. My name is Tracy Chen. I work at TechVantage Solutions. I'm Calvin Munro's executive assistant. My heart stopped. Is Calvin all right? Oh yes, he's fine. I'm calling because... Well, because he asked me to. He saw the article in the Times this morning, and he wanted me to reach out to you on his behalf. I gripped the phone tighter, not trusting my voice to remain steady. What? Did he want you to tell me? He said to tell you that he's proud of what you've accomplished with the foundation. He said your work is important and meaningful, and he wants you to know he respects what you're doing. The words I'd been longing to hear for months, delivered by a stranger because my son couldn't bring himself to call me directly. I should have felt grateful, but instead, I felt something closer to rage. Tracy, I said carefully, did Calvin ask you to call me, or did you decide to call on your own? There was a pause. He asked me to call. He said he wasn't sure what to say to you directly, but he wanted you to know he'd seen the article and that he was proud. I see. And is there anything else he wanted you to tell me? Another pause, longer this time. He said to tell you that He's been thinking about calling you for months, but he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between where you are and where he is now. He said seeing the article made him realize that maybe you don't need him to bridge that gap anymore. The observation was so perceptive, so much like the thoughtful boy I'd raised, that tears started forming in my eyes. But it was also infuriating that he could see the truth so clearly and still choose to communicate it through an intermediary. Tracy, may I ask you something? Of course. How long have you worked for my son? About 3 years. In all that time, has he ever mentioned me, ever talked about his family or where he came from? The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Tracy finally spoke, her voice was softer, more personal. Mrs. Munro, I probably shouldn't say this, but he has your picture on his desk. It's not obvious it's tucked behind his computer monitor where most people wouldn't notice it. But I see it every day when I bring him his morning coffee. It's you and him at what looks like a graduation ceremony, the high school graduation photo. The one where he'd lifted me off my feet and promised to make me proud. He does look at it. Sometimes, Tracy continued, when he thinks no one's watching. Especially when he's having a difficult day or making a hard decision. I think he misses you more than he knows how to admit. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, holding the phone and trying to sort through what I was feeling. Relief that Calvin had seen the article and wasn't angry about it. Frustration that he couldn't call me himself. Pride that he still kept my picture where he could see it. Sadness that we let things get so complicated that a conversation required an intermediary. But underneath all of those emotions was something else, a recognition that Tracy was right. I didn't need Calvin to bridge the gap anymore. I'd built something meaningful without his approval or participation. I'd remembered who I was when I wasn't being anyone's mother. Whether he chose to be part of my life, going forward, was up to him, but it wouldn't determine my worth or happiness. The next morning brought fresh chaos. Good Morning America wanted to schedule a live interview for Friday. The Queensborough President's office called to invite me to a community leadership breakfast. 3 different documentary filmmakers left messages expressing interest in following the Foundation's work, but it was an email from Ariel Lewis that caught my attention. The subject line read, "Follow-up story idea, Delilah, her message." Began, "The response to your Times piece has been incredible, but I'm getting questions from editors about the family dynamics you hinted at in your interview. Would you be willing to tell the fuller story? I think there's a powerful piece to be written about success, family obligations, and what we owe the people who help create our opportunities." I stared at the email for several minutes before deleting it. Some stories were too personal to share with the world, no matter how much good they might do. Calvin and I would have to work out our relationship privately, without the pressure of public scrutiny or the temptation to use media attention as a weapon. But I saved Tracy's phone number in my contacts, not because I planned to use Calvin's assistant as a go-between, but because she'd given me something precious, confirmation that the boy I'd raised was still there, hidden beneath the successful man he'd become, looking at old photos and missing his mother, even if he didn't know how to say so. That evening, as I prepared for another round of interviews and appearances, I realized that everything I'd hoped for when I started the Foundation had come true. I'd honored Tasha's memory, helped students achieve their educational goals, and proven to myself that my life had meaning beyond my role as Calvin's mother. Whether my son chose to be part of that story was still to be determined, but the story itself was complete, meaningful, and entirely mine. The call came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening in January, while I was reviewing grant applications at my kitchen table. The phone rang at exactly 7:15 p.m., and when I saw Calvin's name on the call ID, I stared at it for so long I almost missed the call entirely. "Hello, Calvin. "Hi, Mom." His voice was softer than I remember, uncertain in a way that reminded me of the boy who used to call me from college when he was homesick. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." I looked down at the application. I'd been reading a request from a woman who wanted to learn English so she could help her daughter with homework and realized that everything I was doing now was important. But none of it was more important than this moment. "No, you're not interrupting. How are you?" "I'm good." "Busy, but good." "Mom, I owe you an apology." Several apologies. Actually, I'd imagined this conversation 100 times over the past few months. But now that it was happening, I felt strangely calm. "You don't owe me anything, Calvin." "Yes, I do." His voice was stronger now, more like the man I'd seen in magazine interviews. I saw all the coverage about the foundation. The Times article, the Good Morning America interview, all of it, and I realized how proud I am of what you've built, but also how ashamed I am of my own behavior. "Calvin, please let me finish. I need to say this." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "I cut you out of my life because I was embarrassed by where I came from. Not embarrassed by you specifically, but by the reminders of struggle and sacrifice that you represented. It was easier to create a story about my success that didn't include the 2-bedroom apartment or the second-hand clothes or the nights you worked late grading papers so I could have what I needed." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the polished CEO from the magazine covers. This was my son, finally telling the truth about what had gone wrong between us. "When I saw that Times article," he continued, "I realized that while I was busy erasing my past, you were building something that honored it. You took the same values that got us through those difficult years and used them to help other people. You did what I should have done, remembered where you came from, and used your success to lift others up." I found my voice finally. "You did. Lift others up. Calvin, you built a company that employs hundreds of people. You created something valuable." "I created something profitable," he corrected. "You created something meaningful. There's a difference." We talked for over an hour that night, the longest conversation we'd had in years. He told me about the pressure he'd felt to fit into social circles where his background was a liability, about the way success had isolated him from everything that once felt real and grounding. I told him about the months of silence, about the pain of being erased from his story, about the way building the foundation had helped me remember who I was beyond my role as his mother. "I want to see you," he said as our conversation wound down. "I want to meet the students you're working with, learn about the foundation, maybe figure out how TechVantage could support what you're doing. You don't have to support the foundation to be welcome in my life again," I said carefully. "I know, but I want to. Not as some kind of penance, but because what you're doing matters. And because I want to remember how to care about things that matter instead of just things that profit." He came to Queens the following Saturday, taking the subway for the first time in years, showing up at my apartment in jeans and a sweater instead of the expensive suits I'd seen in photos. He looked older than his 37 years, more serious, but when he smiled at seeing the high school graduation photos still prominently displayed on my mantelpiece, I glimpsed the boy I'd raised. "I kept a copy of this on my desk," he said, picking up the frame. "Tracy probably told you that. She mentioned it. I looked at it every day, especially when I was making decisions I wasn't sure about. I kept thinking about the man in this picture, the one who promised to make you proud. I wondered what he would think of who I'd become." We spent the afternoon at the community center, where Calvin met Rosa and Miguel and Janet, all of whom had benefited from foundation grants. He listened intently as they told their stories, asked thoughtful questions about their goals and challenges, and seemed genuinely moved by their determination to improve their circumstances. "This is what success should look like," he said to me as we watched Miguel help Rosa practice reading a letter from her grandson. Not just personal achievement, but community uplift. That evening, over dinner at the kitchen table where he'd once done homework, Calvin told me about his plans to establish a corporate partnership between TechVantage and the foundation. Not a takeover or a publicity stunt, but a genuine collaboration that would provide ongoing funding and volunteer support for our programs. I can't undo the last few years, he said, as we cleared the dishes. I can't take back the months I didn't call or the way I excluded you from important parts of my life. But I can try to be the man you raised me to be going forward. You already are that man, I said. You just forgot for a while. Over the following months, our relationship slowly rebuilt itself on a new foundation. Calvin visited regularly, sometimes bringing Natalie, who turned out to be genuinely interested in the foundation's work despite my initial skepticism. He spoke at our annual donor dinner, sharing the story of his mother's strength and vision in terms that made me proud to be his parent again. But more importantly, he seemed to remember who he was beneath the success and status he talked about. His father Moore asked questions about our early years as a family and began incorporating stories about his background into his public speaking. Not as traumatourism or inspiration porn, but as honest acknowledgement of the love and sacrifice that had made his achievements possible. The foundation continued to grow, eventually expanding beyond literacy programs to include job training and financial education for working adults. We opened a second location in the Bronx, then a third in Brooklyn. Calvin's corporate partnership brought resources and expertise, but the heart of the organization remained rooted in the community values Tasha and I had tried to instill in our son decades earlier. On the third anniversary of the foundation's establishment, we held a celebration at the original community center in Queens. 300 people attended, including dozens of students who'd received grants, volunteers who'd contributed their time, and donors who'd supported our mission. Calvin gave a speech that night that made me cry, not from sadness this time, but from pure pride. This foundation exists because my mother chose to transform loss into purpose, rejection into resilience, he said, looking directly at me across the crowded room. She could have spent these years feeling sorry for herself, or bitter about the way relationships change when people grow apart. Instead, she built something that will outlast all of us, something that honors both my father's memory and her own unshakable belief in the power of education to transform lives. Later that evening, as we cleaned up the remnants of the celebration, Calvin handed me a small wrapped package. It's not much, he said, suddenly shy in a way that reminded me of the 10-year-old who used to save his allowance to buy me birthday presents. Just something I thought you should have. Inside was a simple gold frame containing a photo I'd never seen before. Calvin and me at his college graduation, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. But it wasn't the photo that made me gasp, it was the inscription he'd written on the matting. For the woman who taught me that success isn't about what you leave behind, but what you build for others to stand on. Thank you for showing me the way home. As I looked at that photo, I realized that everything I'd hoped for when I started this journey had come true, but not in the way I'd expected. I'd set out to make Calvin remember me, to force him to acknowledge the sacrifices I'd made and the love I'd given. Instead, I'd remembered myself, who I was, what I valued, what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. Calvin's return to my life was a gift, but it wasn't the prize. The prize was the woman I'd become in his absence, independent, purposeful, secure in her own worth regardless of who chose to see it. The foundation would continue long after both of us were gone, touching lives and creating opportunities in ways we couldn't predict or control. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Tasha's wedding ring catching the light from the lamp he'd bought at a garage sale 40 years earlier. The simple gold band was even more worn now, smoothed by decades of worrying and hope and determination. But it was still there, still beautiful, still a symbol of love that endures. even when everything else changes. I twisted the ring around my finger and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, from the woman who'd waited by the phone for calls that never came to the woman who'd built something worthy of being remembered, from the mother whose worth was tied to her son's approval to the leader of an organization that had helped hundreds of people transform their lives. Calvin had come home, but more importantly, I'd found my way to a home that belonged entirely to me. The foundation was thriving. My students were achieving their goals, and I was finally, completely, authentically myself. Outside my kitchen window, the lights of Queens stretched toward Manhattan, toward the gleaming towers where my son worked and lived. But I wasn't looking toward him anymore for validation or purpose. I was looking ahead, toward tomorrow's classes and next week's grant reviews and next year's expansion plans. There was still work to do, students to teach, lives to touch. And for the first time in months, that felt like exactly enough. There is something poetic about winter light in Queens. It filters through the windows in thin, silver threads, brushing over old wallpaper and wooden floors with the kind of grace that feels both nostalgic and reverent. I sit in the same chair I always do, the one beside the radiator that still clanks like a metronome marking time. I never asked to pass so quickly. The difference now is what surrounds me, not silence, but movement, not yearning, but fullness. It's been almost a year since Calvin called, a year since that Thursday night when I sat with my phone pressed to my chest, heartbeat echoing in my ears, unsure if I could find words to say to a man I used to know better than myself. And yet, the conversation that followed didn't feel like starting over. It felt like remembering how to breathe in a room that had held its breath too long. Forgiveness is a strange thing. People think it's a door you walk through, clean and simple. But really, it's a long hallway, dimly lit, where you touch the walls in the dark until your eyes adjust. That's what it's been like with Calvin. Every phone call since that night, every visit, every shared memory that floated between us like a fragile paper boat. We've been walking that hallway slowly, cautiously, but together. We've had more dinners together in the past year than in the 5 before it. Sometimes here, where he sits across from me with his phone flipped over so he won't be tempted. Sometimes at restaurants where the waitstaff recognize him but not me, their polite smiles not quite hiding the calculation in their eyes. And sometimes at his penthouse, which still feels more like a hotel suite than a home to me. No matter how many times I've visited, Natalie has surprised me. She's not the caricature I expected, the influencer with a perfect smile and no substance. She's intelligent, curious, and maybe more importantly, she listens. She sits beside Calvin at those dinners and leans in when I speak, as if every story I tell is a secret worth keeping. She asks about my students. She offered to help with the foundation's social media presence, and after my initial hesitation, I said yes. The truth is, her online savvy has helped us raise more money in 6 months than I managed in the entire first year. But if I'm being honest, the best parts of my day still take place in the community center on Northern Boulevard. The classroom is louder now, fuller. We've expanded to full-time instructors, a part-time grant writer, a small team of volunteers. Rosa is now one of those volunteers, helping new students practice their reading. Janet passed her GED exam last spring and cried in my arms outside the testing center. Miguel, he's saving to open his own construction business, and he credits the budgeting class Milo helped us design as the reason. And Milo, well, there's something to say there too. He still wears those wire-rimmed glasses and carries that leather portfolio like it's an extension of his arm. But we no longer only meet in cafes or office spaces. We've had long walks through Central Park, dinners at his place. He makes a roasted chicken that rivals mine, though I won't admit it out loud. And once on a quiet Sunday afternoon we went to the Museum of the City of New York and lost ourselves in an exhibit about public education. It felt fitting, walking side by side through a celebration of the very institution that shaped both our lives so completely. We're not a couple, at least not in the way people might expect. There's something tender and unspoken about our bond, like a duet, where neither instrument wants to dominate. It's not a romance that demands declarations. It's quieter than that, more rooted, and that suits me just fine. At this age, love doesn't need fireworks, it needs companionship, reliability, someone who knows when to pour the tea and when to simply sit in silence. My apartment. The same two-bedroom walk-up that cradled Calvin's childhood and bore the weight of Tasha's absence, now hums with life again. I host board meetings for the foundation here, spread grant proposals across the same kitchen table that once held science fair projects and math homework. The burgundy couch still sags in the middle, and the radiator still sings its winter song. But now there's laughter, conversations, visitors, students who bring tamales wrapped in foil, donors who stay for coffee, volunteers who forget they're supposed to go home at 5. There are days when I forget I once felt invisible. But sometimes, when the sun dips just so and the silence creeps in, I remember the ache of waiting, the weight of wanting. Someone to remember you when you feel like a footnote in your own story. And I think about all the women like me, mothers, grandmothers, caretakers whose labour built empires they were never invited into. I think about what it means to raise someone and then be left behind by the very future you helped forge, which is why we're launching something new. We're calling it the Legacy Literacy Initiative, a partnership between the Foundation, the Queen's Community Centre, and several city organisations. Its mission is simple but radical: to record and preserve the life stories of the students we serve. Oral histories, written memoirs, photography, whatever form they choose. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: too many people go through life unseen, not because they're unremarkable, but because no one ever asked them to speak. I think of Rosa, who used to be terrified to read aloud. Her story of escaping civil war in El Salvador, raising 3 children while working 2 jobs, learning English at 58, who wouldn't be moved by that? I think of Miguel's mother, who never went to school but knew how to stretch $20 into a week of meals. Her wisdom won't be found in textbooks, but it deserves to be documented, celebrated. And I think of myself not because I'm special, but because for years I didn't think I was. Because I spent so long waiting for someone else to write my story that I nearly forgot I could write it myself. Now, I see writing and remembering as forms of resistance. Every grant we give, every class we teach, every voice we help amplify, it's all part of the same mission: to remind people they matter, not just because of what they've done, but because of who they are, where they've been, and what they've survived. We've already raised enough funds to publish our first collection of student stories by next spring. Calvin's company is sponsoring the printing costs, and Natalie offered to help design the layout. Milo will handle the budgeting, and I'll serve as editor-in-chief, a title that makes me laugh every time I say it out loud. And yet, I know Tasha would be proud. He always said stories outlive buildings, even technology. That to pass on the story is to offer someone a roadmap through grief, through joy, through the messy middle of being alive. I didn't understand what he meant when he said it, not really. But I do now. My life used to be defined by loss. Now, it's defined by what I've built in the shadow of it. And I've realized something important: that reconciliation is not a single act, but a commitment. Calvin and I still have our moments. Sometimes he forgets to call. Sometimes I still flinch when he praises me publicly, wondering if it's for show. But we're trying, consistently, imperfectly, but with open hearts. And maybe that's what love looks like at this stage: not certainty, but effort. We're planning a trip, the 3 of us, me, Calvin, and Natalie, back to the old neighbourhood where Tasha and I lived before Calvin was born. The buildings are different now, the corner. Stores turned into smoothie bars and co-working spaces. But I want to show them where it all began, the stoop where Tasha asked me to marry him. The library where I applied for my first teaching job. The playground where Calvin fell and scraped his knee, then asked me if pain ever gets easier the more you feel it. He was 6 when he asked me that. I told him, no, sweetheart. But you get stronger. I didn't know then how true that would become. The journey isn't over. There's more to tell, more to build, more to remember. But for now, as the sun slips behind the skyline and the radiator sings its old tune, I close my notebook, sip my tea, and smile, because for the first time in a long time, I'm not waiting for the phone to ring. I'm writing the next chapter, and I know exactly who I am. There's a ritual I've started that I never expected. Every Sunday morning, before the city is fully awake, I take the subway down to 68th Street and walk to the New York Public Library. Not the grand one with the marble lions, though I've visited that too, but a smaller branch nestled between a coffee shop and a language institute. It's quiet there, homey, and the reading room smells like pencil shavings and old promise. I sit by the tall window with a stack of student essays, a thermos of lemon verbena tea, and a fountain pen I found in a drawer last winter, forgotten among old receipts and expired coupons. There's something about reading those stories in that space, a place where words have always mattered, that reminds me why I started all this. Most of the essays are raw, unedited, full of jagged emotion and grammar that still needs guidance. But they pulse with truth, with the voices of people who never imagined their experiences belonged on paper. Take Sandra's story. A 52-year-old grandmother who wrote about learning to write her name in cursive so she could sign birthday cards instead of leaving them blank. Or Darius, a former inmate who never thought he'd see the inside of a classroom again, now drafting a letter to his teenage son about how failure doesn't have to be permanent. They're not perfect. But then again, neither am I THT something I've come to accept, maybe even celebrate. I spent too long measuring my worth by how perfectly I performed as a mother, a teacher, a woman surviving without complaint. But life isn't about perfection, it's about continuation. About picking up the thread even when it frays. That lesson came home again this past spring when we lost Janet. She'd been battling a quiet illness, one of those conditions that people carry like a secret out of pride or habit. We didn't even know she was sick until she missed 2 classes in a row, and I went to check on her. By the time I got there, it was too late. Her passing shook me. Not just because we'd become close, but because it reminded me that even as we build, we also lose. Even as we celebrate, we mourn. Her death wasn't just an ending, it was a call to urgency. At her memorial, I read one of her final journal entries aloud. In it, she wrote, "I used to think my story ended when I dropped out of 9th grade, but this classroom gave me new pages. I may not have lived a perfect life, but I lived a brave one." Brave, that word sat with me for weeks, because bravery isn't always loud. It's not the headlines or the speeches or the checks with too many zeros. Sometimes bravery is showing up at 68, at 23, at 40 with a felony on your record and a notebook in your hand. Sometimes bravery is signing your name in cursive when no one ever told you it mattered. We decided to dedicate a scholarship in Janet's name, a small fund to cover the cost of GED exam fees for older women who return to school. Calvin covered the first year's awards personally. When I told him, he simply nodded and said, "It's what she deserves." He's still finding his footing in this space, but he's trying. He visits the community centre monthly now, usually with Natalie in tow. She volunteers in our digital literacy class, helping students navigate job application sites and email etiquette. She's gentle and firm, patient in a way that surprises people who only know her from Instagram. One afternoon, I watched her teach Rosa how to attach a photo to an email. When Rosa got it right, she beamed and whispered, "I feel like I just flew an airplane." Natalie laughed, but she didn't condescend. She celebrated like it was the moon landing. That's when I knew Calvin didn't just marry a woman with charm. He married someone who gets it. And as for Calvin, well, the gap between us has narrowed, but not disappeared. I no longer expect him to revert to the boy who made me macaroni portraits for Mother's Day. That version of him lives in a memory I keep tenderly tucked away. But he calls me now, texts, not daily, but regularly. We meet for dinner. He's told me about boardroom conflicts, about Natalie's plans for grad school, about dreams he didn't think he was allowed to have. One night, walking me back to the subway, he said, "I used to think success meant distance from struggle, from mistakes, from anyone who reminded me of the version of myself I was trying to outgrow. But watching you, I realize now that real success is about integration, taking all the pieces with you and saying, 'This is still me.' It took everything in me not to cry right there on the corner of 59th, and Lex. It's taken him time to say those things, just like it took me time to stop waiting for him too. But the words matter less now than the actions." When he sat down with Milo to talk about long-term endowment strategies for the foundation, I didn't say a word. I just watched the two of them, my son and my maybe something more, discussing compound interest like it was the key to world peace. In a way, maybe it is, because peace, I've learned, isn't a moment. It's a posture, a way of living that says, I accept the story I come from, and I am still writing the one I want to leave behind. We're preparing for our biggest project yet. A permanent space. After 4 years of sharing rooms in the community centre and converting classrooms after hours, we've raised enough to lease a small building just 2 blocks away. It used to be a print shop, then a hardware store. Now, it will be the Munro Centre for Adult Learning and Community Storytelling. The naming was Calvin's idea. I resisted. At first worried it sounded grander than we deserved. But he looked at me and said, "You've built more legacy in 5 years than most people do in a lifetime. If your name doesn't belong on the front door, whose does?" I didn't argue after that. We're renovating it ourselves, mostly with volunteer help. Miguel is managing the build-out. He finally got his general contractor license, and every week I stop by with sandwiches and coffee, watching the space transform. Room by room, wall by wall. There will be a library stocked with bilingual materials, a computer lab, a multi-purpose room for poetry nights, health workshops, sitters unchipped classes. A small office for me, though I suspect I'll still spend most of my time out on the floor with the students, and in the foyer, there will be a wall of portraits. Not of donors, not of board members, but of students. Framed photos with short captions: who they are, what they've learned, what they want to teach. We call it the room we leave behind, because long after we're gone, I want people to walk into that building and know whose voices built it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I still think of Tasha. I wonder what he'd make of all this, his wife. On NPR, his son bridging the distance, a building with his name engraved in steel and glass. I hope he'd be proud, not just of what we've built, but of how we've learned to stay soft in a world that wanted to make us hard. How we've stitched family back together with thread that isn't blood, but chosen love. I often wear his wedding ring around my neck now, too loose for my finger, too sacred to let go. It swings gently against my chest as I walk through classrooms and sit in meetings. A reminder not just of what I lost, but of what I chose to become in the aftermath. One night, after the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new centre, Calvin stayed behind to help clean up. We sat on folding chairs in the empty space, paper cups of lukewarm cider in our hands. He said, "You know, I used to think you stayed in that apartment because you were stuck." But now I realize you stayed because you had roots, because home wasn't about size or prestige. It was about history. I looked around the new space, saw the echoes of laughter, the possibility in every empty chair. I didn't just stay, I said. I grew from there, and now so much has grown from. ME. Students who read to their children for the first time. Workers who negotiate fair wages after learning their rights. Elders who write their names in block letters and cry at the sight of it. My son, who found his way back not just to me, but to himself. People think legacy is what we leave behind, but I think it's what we continue in others, in buildings filled with stories. In the echo of our values passed hand to hand like water in a drought. The world will forget the details, but it won't forget the feeling. And I've made peace with that. So tonight, as the lights dim in our new home and I close the last grant application of the week, I pour myself a cup of tea and sit by the window. Outside, the city pulses restless, alive. But in here, I feel complete. Not because everything has been resolved, but because I now know I never needed to be remembered to matter. I just needed to live like I did. And I do. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.